Okay, so you've seen the Otter, and that was Seamus Heaney reading it, and you probably worked out from the pictures that went with it that it's another love poem, similar in many ways to the Skunk, where he takes a creature and compares it with his wife. I suppose the difference would be, to me at least, that the Otter is slightly less surprising as something to choose to compare his wife with, in that it's graceful, pretty, and doesn't have those sort of negative connotations I suppose you'd get with a skunk. But the idea, I think, is quite similar, in that a lot of his love poetry, like the skunk, excuse me, unlike Night Drive, he doesn't tend to create a sort of over the top traditional romantic poem. But I think this one of Night Drive and Skunk and the Otter, I think this one is perhaps the closest to something more traditional in that sense, and I'll show you what I mean. Because one reason is that we don't really get any references to the Otter apart from the title, and then in stanza 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 till the last stanza. So the title says, this is about an otter, and then he seems to be talking about a person, and then it's the last part where we see the otter, the idea of the otter comes back, which we'll talk about a bit later. So, but that begins straight away, because he says, when you plunged, the light of Tuscany wavered and swung through the pool from top to bottom. So straight away, because it's a personal pronoun, we get this sort of feeling that he may well be talking about a person as opposed to a creature. Not necessarily, but there we are. Now, but he has remembered, I haven't got it here, but the title is The Otter, so you can't forget the title. So straight away we would be thinking, perhaps, who is this? And I've taken this from that Prezi, from a Prezi presentation, and there's two of them on the internet which I've nicked. These annotations aren't brilliant, and some of them I think are wrong, so I'll tell you as we go along. But and I've attached them, by the way. I've put a link at the bottom of the list where you can go to both Prezis. Anyway, so it's not, because it says the Otter, it's not entirely clear who it is, and then that's important because he is in some ways just describing an otter, and the point of that is that he sees in it a kind of beauty and I think a single-mindedness and a sort of intentness, which he talks about later, which he clearly sees in his wife as well. So the personal pronoun makes it slightly ambiguous, but it begins to suggest that he's talking about not only an otter but also a person. So when you plunge, the light of Tuscany wavered and swung through. So we've got this temporal conjunction here. It's a temporal because it's talking about time, isn't it? Temporal conjunction, if you think about grammar. And because it starts with this subordinate clause, when you plunged, and then the main clause, the light of Tuscany wavered, the idea is, because you've got the subordinate clause first, when you plunged, and the main clause later, there's a sense in which the you is foregrounded. So it's foregrounded by dint of being at the start of the sentence. So that's how it's foregrounded. So the you, she, or the otter, seems to be affecting the the whole of nature almost. Light, which is kind of everything, isn't it? The sun, the life giver, and everything. So whoever it is, whether it's the otter or her, somehow it seems to him this thing seems to be powerful and can affect nature and therefore him and his feelings quite strongly. When you plunge, the light of Tuscany wavered, the whole light of a whole area, part of Italy, Tuscany, wavered. So it seems like the huge impact of this metaphor of light moving, the whole of the light, you imagine the whole sky and everything all somehow wavering under the power of this thing, person, otter, whatever it is. So I suggest it sort of suggests a kind of power and a beauty, and I think that's what he's getting in that metaphor there. And then swung through the pool from top to bottom. So even, you think of the light in the pool as it's from top to bottom, so the whole of the pool is completely almost transformed by the entrance of her. So there's a kind of oops, that's not the word I'm after. A kind of transformation takes place when she dives in, and the otter. Remember, when I say she, can you think what I mean is both the wife and the otter? Because you have this range. I've talked to you about a range sentence before. Oops, a range sentence or a range clause, from top phrase rather, not clause, from top to bottom. So from such and such to such and such suggests a range through everything, doesn't it? Okay. We've also got here these U sounds: plunged, swung. Oops, something's gone wrong there. And they're quite, in terms of phonology, they're sort of, you've got a very sort of low sounding, a low vowel sound, haven't you? A low vowel sound. A kind of a heavy sounding vowel. And what I mean by that, if you compare it with vowels that are shorter or higher, like I and o, has a kind of depth to the sound, and so it's a good. And he repeats it with swung, plunged. So that depth is associated, is partly created through phonology of the noise of this somebody diving or diving into the water. And also I think the verb plunged suggests depth. And now if you listen to that word and you think of all its connotations, compared with like a word like splash, or even worse, even more strongly, a silly word like splish. Okay, you got the short vowel sound compared with the long vowel sound, and followed by the ng and the voiced plosive at the start, the unvoiced plosive at the start, all gives it a kind of depth of sound, and that is echoed with swung. Wavered, to me, a verb that suggests if you're wavering, you're not sure. It's almost as if somehow the whole world has been thrown into kind of indecision and confusion. But also, you can see, I hope, there's a fair bit of assonance. So fro, o, to, bo, to. This isn't working very well. O, to. Through, pool, to, so they're all linked, and we got swung, to, for Tuscany, plunged, you obviously links with to and through and pool. You got fair bit of alliteration of the, and then t. And also you'll notice that the whole sentence is one whole verse, one whole complete stanza. So I think, to me, that sense of when somebody dives in the water and then it's like one event, one whole event, all concentrated in this one stanza. So that's why you get the enjambment as well as it goes from line to line. So when you plunge, the light of Tuscany wavered and swung through the pool from top to bottom. We don't get any end-stop lines, so there's enjambment as well, suggesting a long, smooth uninterrupted movement of the dive into the pool. Okay. So now, why is he talking about Tuscany wavering and all this kind of thing, and the light being affected and swing through the pool? Well, there's a whole tone of admiration in this poem. Admiration, physical admiration, and sort of obviously that would connect with love and lust and sex and all that kind of stuff. But also a kind of admiration of just the person behind the body, as it were, and the creature as well. I think he's sort of simply also writing about nature and admiration for nature. And again, we're still not quite sure, as it says here, is this an otter, or but then we get shoulders, which no, swimmer's back and shoulders seems to suggest, as it says here, a woman. I loved your wet head and smashing crawl, your fine swimmer's back and shoulders surfacing and surfacing again this year and every year since. I hope you can see all the sibilants in here. And it says here this S sibilance flows off the tongue. It's lyrical, given the sense of kind of euphony as well. But also just the alliteration, the sibilance suggesting the splashing, the splashing, of the water sounds to create a memorable and a sensual poem. It's a strange adjective, isn't it? Smashing crawl. I don't know. Again, that doesn't seem to me to suggest an otter, because as a front, you get the idea of front crawl is a stroke, swimmer's stroke, isn't it? And it tends to make a bit of splashing and smashing the water, and it's quite a onomatopoeic, as it says there. Oops, I've said it already. Onomatopoeic word. So that's more phonology, and so it's the sound of her splashing in the water. But an otter doesn't splash. It's sort of, when it swims, it's very quiet and goes under the water really. So that would again suggest more like human than otter. But also it says, interestingly, at the same time, he's deliberately kind of making it ambiguous because he got wet head. Now, when I might, if I was thinking of a woman, I would think wet hair as opposed to wet head. Now, an otter's head is very smooth, isn't it? So it seems, to me, that seems to suggest more of an otter than a human. The only point is to say that, he's deliberately all the time suggesting both creatures because he wants to make a connection with them, with the two of them, because I think he sees the grace and the beauty of the otter as something that he kind of remembers. And also he is talking about actually going to a river, I think the same place in Tuscany, year after year, and seeing this, just watching the otter. So the otter he seems to have seen for year after year, and he's still sort of, I don't know what's the word, kind of obsessed, not obsessed, but certainly interested in and fascinated by the creature. And you get the repetition here, and again simply to create the idea of her coming up, or the otter up and down in the water again and again. And you get the repetition of and, which I think does the same thing. And you get repetition of year, does the same thing. All that repetition is a sense of time passing, but not only, year on year. So it's also the idea of their sort of the sort of history of their marriage, which he gets into later on in the poem as well. So in terms of the structure of this, the enjambment continues as it did in the last stanza. It's quite similar in a way, because actually there's a mistake here. That should be a full stop. If you look in the anthology, there should be a full stop there. It's quite important. Anyway, so the enjambment continues through as she swims. So you just, he's describing the creatures or the woman's sort of graceful swimming, and it's surfacing again and again, and she's swimming up and down, or it's swimming up and down, which would suggest movement. So the poem moves along quite quickly as he does those things. You wouldn't want it to stop because that wouldn't seem to fit. But then you'll see as you go to the next stanza that all changes here, because he now, for I think oh no, not the first time, but he does refer to himself here, and so he rather than just referring to himself before in the starter line stanza 2 he says, "I loved your wet head," so he's saying his feelings towards her, but this time he's actually talking about himself and his own feelings in this stanza here. And you can see how very much more sort of slow in a sense, or thoughtful it is, because he's now describing himself. And what's he doing? "I sat dry-throated on the warm stones. You were beyond me." So you have an end stop line there and an end stop line there. The mellowed clarities, the grape deep air, thinned and disappointed. Now you've got some enjambment there. You get a comma here, which slows things up a bit, and another full stop there. So this is a description of himself. Now he's not doing anything. He's sitting, so there's no movement. It's very much the opposite, dry-throated, compared, it says, with wet head and pool and plunge and all those references to water that we get before. And on the warm stones, suggesting sort of it's Tuscany, so it'll be quite hot, and sitting on stones that are warm, seems quite uncomfortable. Certainly dry-throated seems uncomfortable compared with the freedom and the energy and the movement that we've had before. And then we get this very short, simple sentence, "You were beyond me." Now, a barrier between them, it says water and land. So yes, so literally you've got the water and then you've got the land, and there's Seamus. There he is, look, sitting there with his funny hair, and there's the otter or the woman or whatever it is. So there's a barrier, isn't there? Okay, so and there's a sense that they sort of don't quite connect in some way. Now, in terms of Deixis and time, he's saying "you were beyond me," so this is a memory. He's always talking in the past tense, and somehow that perhaps this is earlier in the relationship. And if you think about the way he's described her and the creature as this sort of wonderful swimmer and sort of physically impressive individual, I think there's a sense that he seems like to feel different and to feel excluded in some way. That perhaps, I don't know, perhaps he can't swim, I don't know, but that the idea being that somehow there's this kind of something between them, some barrier or other. And so this is the kind of, the more, as I said, this sort of non-traditional sense of a love poem. Everything else so far has been quite traditional, as he talks about her body and and the fine swimmer's back and all this kind of thing. It's all very, his admiration for her is very obvious. But this here suggests a kind of distance between them. And perhaps earlier on in the relationship there was that kind of distance. And then he says, and this is about the weather in Tuscany, or the climate, I suppose. The mellowed clarities, the grape deep air. Now, I don't know, so grape is obviously associated with wine. And I think there's an associate here. I know this is French really, but there is a red wine, called a claret. Now, it's nothing to do with the word clarity. It's just what you call red wine. And I think there is, perhaps he's playing with that notion of grapes and wine and claret and clarities, that kind of thing. He's done it before, hasn't he? In talks about wine in some other poem, I can't remember which. But certainly the idea of the grape, and then deep, it's just water as well, doesn't it, in some way? And what happened? Well, there's a kind of personification of nature here, that they thinned and disappointed. Now, as the summer comes towards an end, you know, there's a change in the sort of atmosphere, I think. And so there's a sense in which he's talking about the weather changing and becoming thinner and less intense, perhaps. The intense flavour of wine, the intense flavour of grapes, the smell, the scent of wine or the scent of apes, all those kind of things that also reflect an idea of the marriage changing, and perhaps being, that says disappointed. I don't know. That sounds quite negative, doesn't it? So perhaps again, like in what was it? I think the skunk. Oh no, sorry, not the skunk. The other one, Night Drive. A sense of the marriage changing. And perhaps the idea of, that first flush of love becoming thinner, and that sort of lust and all that kind of, and love becoming thinner and disappointing in some way. Or is she disappointed in him in some way? And I think that might connect with the next verse. And mellowed also, to me, the adjective suggests perhaps people, you say, somebody as they get older, they mellow. Why is that doing that? Stop it! Thank you. The idea of people changing, people's characters changing, becoming more mellow, becoming less kind of, perhaps the relationship becoming more mellow. And if if something that's clear mellows, perhaps becoming less clear as well. The idea of perhaps a kind of complexity arriving in the relationship. All those things are possibilities to think about. And then he goes on, and this links to the last point. Thank God for the slow loadening. Now, it's a weird word, which, because it's a weird word, tends to sort of foreground it and makes it stick out to us, doesn't it? To load is to load something. It's just a different way of saying to load something. So, the loadening, as it says here, is the slow development of the relationship. That the relationship, he says, he seems thankful for the fact that he has had time and the relationship's gone on for a long time. So over years and years, they've sort of grown closer and closer, slowly, not in any kind of, thunderbolt and lightning, cliched, love at first sight type of thing. So perhaps the suggestion is that, they weren't sort of automatically very close, because we're saying, yes, she was beyond him. Perhaps he feels slightly inferior to her, that he could never be this wonderful physical specimen that she seems to be. Very similar to the sort of admiration he gets for his father and grandfather in Digging, in a way. Obviously, he doesn't want to have sex with them, but you get the point, the idea of him looking at somebody else and feeling kind of inferior almost to them. But he just thanks God, and this is quite colloquial, isn't it? That thank God for something is quite colloquial. There's almost a sort of self-deprecating, sort of humorous feel or tone to that. Oh, thank God, in that quite colloquial, high-frequency phrase that he uses there. When I hold you now, we are closed and deep as the atmosphere on water. Now, just to be clear, in your version, it's close. I said that wrongly there, so just get rid of that in your mind. It basically means the same one. So when I hold you now, and so this is the deixis, isn't it? To orientate us as readers and him now and then. The deixis here alerts us to now it has changed, and we have that same temporal conjunction we had before. So both those things are telling us, no, things now are different. When I hold you now, we are close. That should say close and deep. Now that idea of depth has come back a lot, hasn't it? The depth. Now when we think of the word deep, we have obviously deep water, but also depth of feeling, deep feelings for one another. Okay, so that's obviously what he's doing, playing with that word now. So that distance has been closed over time in this idea of a slow just growth of a relationship. And kind of unromantic, because and often you'll see older couples will say, life, relationships change as things get on a bit, and you seem you're closer in some ways and less close in others as you get older. And this similarly here, it says here the way atmosphere and water are close, and so are they. So in terms of just the physical attribution of those two things, I suppose you can imagine it visually in that the water's there, and then obviously the atmosphere, the air. If this is the water under here, and then this is the air here, they're close. They're sort of physically close. As you look at the horizon, across water, they look close. If you look at the sea on a blue sky, against a blue sky, they're almost kind of, you can't tell the difference between them. But also the physical properties of atmosphere and water, the difference is water's just thicker, isn't it, I suppose, in a way. And I wonder whether this as well, he said he was sitting dry-throated and she's all splashing about in the water, whether he sees there's a difference between them. So if he's the atmosphere and she's the water type of thing, that in the way they're different personalities, but they're close, nevertheless. We might look at some of the assonance or phonology in here. You get it's slow and low, slow loading, and the hold, closed. There's certainly, again, what assonance and alliteration, one thing that they do is they just sort of link things up. They just unite one word with another, so it gives a sense of unity to a phrase, or in this case 3 lines. It links them together. Now he's trying to get the idea of closeness, so him and his wife sort of as one. So therefore the idea of the use of repeating vowel sounds or repetition here, or what you call it, assonance here, just helps build that unity phonologically, as well as with semantics, as well as with meaning. Okay, so continuing now, we are now in the present. So he's talking about, in time, the Dixis was you were, it wasn't the past tense, and you are. So it's now brought into the present tense. Things have changed, that transformative feel that you got in Night Drive, where things sort of changed in a way. He talks about now how things have changed. So he says that now my 2 hands are plumbed water. So he has this metaphor here. To again suggest depth. So plumb, right, a plumb line, if you ever have a plumb line, it's a way of measuring something. So if you wanted to measure the depth of the water, if there's a water, you'd get a piece of string and you'd stand on the bank and you'd drop your piece of string in, but you'd tie a heavy weight to it so it'd drop in a straight line, and then you'd be able to see where it got to and measure that distance. And you can measure the distance of anything like that, can't you? Like a wall or something, the length, the depth of something. But it always, because it relies on gravity, so you have heavy weight at the end, it always relates to depth. So the depth of their relationship again is referenced. You get that sound, which is, and a word here, plumbed, which is very similar to the word we got at the start, which was plunged. But this time he's involved. My It's not just her, my two hands. Now, he is now the water, and so there's a sense in which he's very he's all around her. Before, earlier on in the poem, he was sort of excluded. He says, doesn't he, that you were beyond me in this one. And he was dry-throated, and on warm stones. But now it's all changed, as after the slow development of their relationship, now they've got to this stage where they're very, very close as atmosphere and water. And he is now the water, so he's almost like they're part of each other. And I think, where have I got it here? One of the prezzies that I have attached to this says of this, she's swimming within him. He is her pool, her infinity. She is his, he is hers. The stanza is pretty sexual. His hands are now the water holding her. She is basically putty in his hands. That's not a bad way of describing it, I think. And now we have these possessive pronouns, my and my. So the pronouns have changed to possessive pronouns, and you can see the change here grammatically. And we go back up, we've got back up further. It's you and I, so he starts with you. When you plunged, it's very much him watching, and from the outside watching things go on, watching her. And then he says that I loved your wet head, so it's hers again. The possessive pronoun is hers. And what's he doing? Well, he's excluded, sat dry-throated on the stones. But then finally, when we get to here, when I hold you, now we. So we get the plural, the first person plural there for the first time. So as the pronouns change, the relation that reflects their relationship change. And now we've got the possessive pronouns, my. So if you feel that you own something in a way, and I don't think he means it in a kind of, he's the boss kind of way. I think he just means that he feels now completely kind of at home with her, and as if he is part of her, as it says in that description, and she's a part of him. So, and going back to this idea of plumbed, if you look it up, you'll see it says here, there's various ones. To plumb something is to measure the depth of the body of water, but also it means to explore or experience. So she had plumbed the depths of depravity. If you plumb the depths, it means that you go right to the bottom, you see everything, you explore, probe, search, examine, investigate, penetrate. And some of these words, these synonyms here are quite sexual, aren't they? Penetrate and probe, I suppose, it's kind of an unpleasant word, but certainly the sense of him being get to the bottom of, being very, very sort of close to her, and that word has that connotation here. And he says, you're my palpable. Palpable mean if something's palpable, you can feel it, you can touch it. So there's an opposition there, isn't there? Because a memory is not touchable. It's a memory, it's a thought, you can't touch it. But a palpable memory seems to be a contradiction or a juxtaposition or an oxymoron even. So it's oxymoronic, I suppose, in that they seem to be opposite, and paradoxical. But the paradox is deliberately used to between these two words to foreground the idea that the memory and she as a person is so strong that he can feel it almost. And lithe means thin and graceful, as it says there, but also strong, I think, and that's a sort of sexual image as well, or a kind of complementary. If somebody's lithe, it's a sort of physical compliment. And we have, you're my palpable lithe otter of memory in the pool of the moment. In that when he thinks about watching this otter, it's always a very intense, it seems, doesn't it, memory, a very sensual memory, and so she's just like that, and a very sort of lives very intensely in his mind, and palpably. Again, the idea of him being close to her physically, and the pool of the moment. As in the memory so strong it seems to be happening now, and that's why you get the phonological links between memory, moment, to link those two. Again, almost paradoxical in that memory is the past and the moment is now. But he's saying that, when he thinks of thinking of this experience in Tuscany, all right, and this is back in the past, and he's watching the otter. There's the river, and the otter's in there, and possibly, again, it could be the otter, it could be her, either, but it's certainly back in time. They go forwards in time. Since then, their relationship has deepened. He has now sort of got into the water. His hands are plumbed water. He's become the water rather than being on the outside and watching. And now that memory that's here in the past seems to be here. There seems to be no difference. The memory of the moment, it seems to be that they're the same, which is why he links them phonologically to link those two words. And also he links the others like plumbed, palpable, pool with these P sounds, the unvoiced plosive P. And I think that's to suggest the plunging, the diving in sound, but also that the memory is deep, his relationship is deep, as in plumbed, it's palpable, it's very alive and real in his mind, and the pool is that metaphor that he's used all the way through for memory and for their relationship and the development of their relationship. He then continues to describe turning to swim on your back, each silent, thigh-shaking kick, retilting the light, heaving cool at your neck. So each kick retilts the light, and that's very much like the opening idea of when you plunge, the light of Tuscany wavered. So again, it seems now there's no deixis here in that sense. He doesn't say when this is. There's no past or present. He doesn't say you were or you are. So if you look back here, you says here, my hands are plumbed water. When you look at the start of the poem, you say when you plunged, the light of Tuscany wavered. That's all in the past tense, and when suggests the past as well, that temporal conjunction. But now we've got ing verbs, turning, retilting, heaving, which don't tell us the tense, but swim suggests the present. So the tense here is slightly more ambiguous, but it does feel more ongoing, because you have these ing verbs, these non-finite verbs. These progressive verbs. So progressive verbs, by the way, are these ing verbs. So if you say like she was turning, okay, that verb then, that verb phrase, was turning, is called the past progressive, because it was happening. If you say she is turning, then that verb phrase is the present progressive. Now, if you look at this, we have neither, because he elides or misses out the to be part of it, the was and is. So turning to swim on your back, each silent thigh shaking, kick, retilting the light, heaving cool at your neck. It doesn't say was or is, so they are progressive verbs, but we can't tell whether they're past or present, and that's deliberate, I think, because he wants to sort of mix the past and the present, to say that this memory of the past is very much alive, but so is the present, and that the the progressive aspect of the ing verb suggests it ongoing. It's happening now, almost heaving, tilting, turning. So that memory that he talks about up here as being palpable and of the moment suggests a memory that's so strong that it almost mixes with the present, which again gives the depth of feeling, I think, and the depth of and the importance of memory to him. And also, that I meant to say about this idea of light, that she seems to be, or the otter seems to be, changing the environment to have such power to tilt the light, retilt the light. And again, it's not just tilt, it's retilt, as if it's happening again. And he does talk about repetition, or things happen again and again, year after year, doesn't he? That he keeps going back there every year, and he sees the otter again, and this brings back the memory of his wife and all that kind of thing. Okay. We also have these, phonologically, lots of the unvoiced plosive k sound, or K, or hard C sound, or K sound. So k, kick, neck. We have plosives t, turning to, silent, light, cool, neck, at. Lots of unvoiced T and K sounds, tilting. And I know it sounds a bit odd, but I think this gives a sense of sort of coolness in a way, sort of in a kind of synesthetic way. If you compare it with earlier on in stanza 3, sort of warm stones and mellowed, and thinned. There's these nasal sounds which sound to me warmer, and there's a sense in which he says cool at your neck. That sort of has a cooler sound to it, and also the sharper sounds, perhaps suggesting the strength, and perhaps suggesting the sound of the water, the splashing of the water, and the sharp splashing sound of the water as well. And then we get a change of tone and suddenly, so the conjunction, the coordinating conjunction, suggests kind of unexpected, because an unexpected change, because the conjunction is normally in the middle of a sentence, but it's at the beginning of this, suggests a change, and so does, of course, suddenly the adverb. You're out. Back again, intent as ever. Heavy and frisky in your freshened pelt. Well, pelt would be the otter's fur. A pelt is just a fur, the thing that covers creatures that are furry. Their fur is their pelt. Intent as ever. This is heavy, which is not really very complimentary to his wife, but perhaps it just means heavy with water. The soaked pelt of the creature, and also her sort of, and perhaps just a sense in both creatures, both her and the otter are just a bit heavier. They look a bit heavier on land than they do in water, because they're not being buoyed up by the water. Frisky has got a vaguely sexual connotation, I think. Printing the stones, she's printing the stones, suggesting leaving a mark, and also suggesting perhaps something artistic and creative about her. Before, it says connection to stones before, because he says before, doesn't he, that he was dry-throated, sitting on warm stones, and almost as if when she comes along she prints the stones, that she has changed that again it suggests her and their relationship changing, because formerly he was alone on the dry warm stones, but now she's with him printing the stones. Intent suggests the intelligence of the creature, but also her intelligence, and also her being alert. And intent also suggests a kind of determination. Perhaps he's telling us something about her character that he admires, and he admires the otter for it as well. And back again, he says before, doesn't he, about things returning, surfacing and surfacing again this year and every year since, he says in the second stanza, suggesting that she'll always come back to him. There's a sense in which he feels now confident, as opposed to before when he felt that she was beyond him in some way. Now there's almost an assumption that she will change, or return to him all the time. because he says intent as ever. Again, that suggests that sort of almost a deictic sentence phrase, isn't it? Suggesting time, meaning forever and ever. So deixis there as well. And again, in terms of the structure, you get very similar to a lot of the stanzas. That it's all one stanza is one sentence. Suggest and with enjambment all the way through, suggesting movement, suggesting alertness, suggesting smooth movements, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the Otter, and it's probably, if it was going to be paired with one, you can imagine it being paired with either Night Drive or the Skunk, probably more likely the Skunk. And how does he use, I don't know, nature to explore love and relationships or something like that? And I suppose you could, there's lots of poems about relationships, aren't there, through everything that he says, and nature and relationships, whether that's with his family or whether it's more with his wife as he gets later on in his career.